Hello, and welcome to Mind Sherlock, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Today, I bring you a brand new Sherlock Holmes mystery, filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel the case together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now, let's get started. It was on one of those singularly oppressive evenings in late autumn, when the fog from the Thames crept through the streets like a living thing, that I found myself once more in the familiar surroundings of 221 B. Baker Street. Holmes, as was often his custom during periods of inactivity, had cast himself upon the settee, his long fingers interlocked upon his chest, his piercing eyes fixed upon the ceiling, with an expression of infinite weariness. I knew these moods well. They descended upon him in the absence of a case, a void which neither tobacco nor the musings of his violin could fully fill. Indeed, the fire had burned low, and the only sound in the room was the methodical tapping of Holmes's fingers against his sleeve, a sure sign of his increasing impatience with the world's apparent lack of intrigue. "You have been unusually silent, Watson," he murmured at length without altering his gaze. "Might I infer that you are engaged in a study of my melancholy? Or has Mrs. Hudson perhaps slipped a sedative into your tea?" "I was merely reflecting, Holmes," I said, setting down my newspaper. "It is rare indeed that London should afford you so little occupation." He exhaled sharply. "My dear fellow, London is always brimming with crime, but it appears that Scotland Yard insists upon botching it without my interference. Lestrade, no doubt, will soon come knocking over some trifling burglary masquerading as a great enigma." He sighed and closed his eyes, but even as he did, the distant sound of hurried footsteps on the staircase reached our ears. Holmes sat up at once, the listlessness evaporating from his frame. "Ah," he murmured, with the faintest trace of amusement. "At last, a worthy distraction." The door flew open, and with it entered the mystery that would lead us to the very heart of a royal conspiracy. The man who burst into our sitting room was drenched in rain, his heavy coat clinging to his frame, the wide-brimmed hat upon his head streaming with moisture. His breath came in ragged gasps, as though he had run a great distance, and his gloved hands trembled as he removed the soaked hat, revealing a stern, weather-beaten face lined with tension. Holmes had already risen, his sharp gaze sweeping over the visitor with a practised eye. "You have travelled a long way, sir," he observed. "Judging by the cut of your coat and the faint scent of tobacco, Czech blend, unless I am mistaken, you are from Bohemia. And unless I greatly err, you have arrived by train within the hour, having had neither time to refresh yourself nor remove the road's imprint upon your person. This, coupled with your pallor and evident distress, suggests a matter of some urgency. Pray, sir, what brings you to Baker Street at this late hour?" The stranger stared in astonishment, then inclined his head. "You are indeed the man of whom I've heard much, Mr. Holmes. My name is Major Léon Dufresne, an emissary of King Alaric II of Bohemia. I have come to seek your help in a matter of utmost secrecy. A crime most terrible has befallen my country, and the fate of a kingdom now hangs in the balance." He reached into his coat and produced a folded telegram, his hand unsteady. "His Majesty is dead, Mr. Holmes, poisoned," and with his final breath, he uttered words that no man has yet been able to decipher. "The Black Throne, betrayal in the shadow of the crown. The nightingale knows. I have been sent to you because my sovereign was murdered, and I fear his last words hold the key to his assassin's identity. Holmes took the telegram, his expression unreadable. Then slowly, a gleam of keen interest lit his eyes. "This," he said, "is most promising indeed." Major Dufresne sat forward, his broad shoulders tense, his fingers tightening around the telegram he had just handed to Holmes. His voice, though steady, carried the unmistakable weight of grief and urgency. "King Alaric II is dead, Mr. Holmes," he said gravely. "Poisoned within the walls of his own palace. The finest physicians in Bohemia were powerless to save him. By the time they were summoned, it was already too late." Holmes leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. "The precise nature of the poison?" Dufresne shook his head. "Unknown. His Majesty was found in his private study, seated at his desk as though he had merely fallen asleep. The only sign of distress was the faintest trace of blue upon his lips." "Prussic acid, perhaps," Holmes murmured, half to himself. "Or something more insidious." Dufresne continued. "His valet discovered him at dawn, and by midday the Prime Minister had already ordered Dr. Reinhardt, the royal physician, placed under arrest. It is said that he alone administered the king's medicines, and so suspicion fell upon him at once." Holmes drummed his fingers upon the armrest. "A convenient scapegoat," he mused. "But you are not convinced of his guilt." "I am not," Dufresne said firmly. "Dr. Reinhardt is a man of unquestionable loyalty. The king trusted him above all others. He would sooner take his own life than betray his sovereign." "And yet the Prime Minister was swift to act," Holmes remarked. "Almost too swift." Dufresne hesitated, then lowered his voice. "There are whispers, Mr. Holmes, that the king suspected treachery, that he had confided in someone, a confidant whose name is lost to us." Holmes's fingers ceased their drumming. "Suspected," he repeated. "A man who senses betrayal is often right to do so. The question is, did he leave behind a warning?" Dufresne nodded. "That is why I have come to you, Mr. Holmes, because before he died, the king spoke his last words." Dufresne drew a deep breath before speaking again. The king's last words were heard by his chamberlain, who was present in his final moments. With the last of his strength, he whispered, "The Black Throne. Betrayal in the shadow of the crown. The nightingale knows." A silence fell upon the room. Holmes remained motionless, his gaze fixed upon the fire, his sharp profile illuminated by the flickering light. Watson, despite himself, felt a chill run through him. There was something hauntingly deliberate about the words. They were not the delirious ramblings of a dying man, but rather the final act of a keen mind, determined to pass on a message. "The Black Throne," Holmes murmured at last. "A specific object or a symbolic reference?" "I do not know," Dufresne admitted. "The throne in the royal hall is of dark carved oak, but whether it holds significance, I cannot say." "And the nightingale?" Holmes mused. "An allusion to a person, or perhaps to an object bearing its likeness." Dufresne's expression darkened. "There is something, Mr. Holmes. The king possessed a timepiece, a pocket watch he cherished above all others. It was said to be a gift from his late father, and its casing bore the engraving of a nightingale. But when his body was found, the watch was missing." "Curious," Holmes murmured. His fingers steepled before him, and a small, almost imperceptible smile played upon his lips. "Yes, most curious indeed." Holmes remained silent for several moments, his keen mind assembling the puzzle pieces before him. When he spoke at last, there was a crisp finality in his tone. "You were right to come to me, Major Dufresne," he said. "The arrest of Dr. Reinhardt is at best a hasty assumption, and at worst, a deliberate misdirection. The true murderer has taken great pains to conceal his crime. Watson, who had been listening intently, could not help but interject. "Then you mean to accept the case, Holmes?" Holmes rose from his chair, reaching for his overcoat. "Accept it? My dear Watson, I believe I was meant to solve it." He turned to Dufresne. "We leave for Bohemia on the first train. The answers we seek lie within the halls of the late King's palace." And with that, the game was set in motion. The train to Bohemia cut swiftly through the autumn landscape, its rhythmic motion a counterpoint to the silent contemplation of my companion. Holmes had scarcely spoken since our departure from London, save for the occasional cryptic remark about the peculiar nature of our case. "I have always found, Watson," he said at last, "that the weight of a mystery lies not in the volume of its unknowns, but rather in the precision of its contradictions. And this case, I suspect, is riddled with them." I glanced at him over my newspaper. "You believe the King's words to be deliberate, then? Not the incoherent ramblings of a dying man?" Holmes' lips curved slightly. The King, by all accounts, was an astute and measured man. If he had merely wished to name his murderer, he would have done so outright. Instead, he left behind a cipher. A riddle meant not just to identify his betrayer, but perhaps to expose something far greater. I could not repress a shiver. "And you believe we shall find our answers within the palace?" "Unquestionably," Holmes replied. "For murder, my dear Watson, is rarely the act of a single hand. It is the culmination of opportunity, motive, and more often than not, the illusion of power. We are walking into a nest of vipers, and I dare say we shall soon see which of them carries the deadliest bite." As we arrived at the royal station, a contingent of guards awaited us, their faces impassive beneath plumed helmets. At their head stood a severe-looking man in diplomatic attire, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd before locking on to us. "That," Holmes murmured, stepping forward, "would be our welcoming committee." We were received with little ceremony and led through the vast stone corridors of the Bohemian palace, where silence reigned with unnatural force. It was the silence of uncertainty, of whispered secrets held behind heavy doors. The guards, solemn and watchful, escorted us to the late King's private study, the very room in which he had drawn his final breath. The chamber was an impressive one, lined with dark oak and dimly illuminated by the faint morning light filtering through heavy drapes. Nothing seemed disturbed, no sign of forced entry, no shattered glass or overturned furniture. It was a scene of absolute order, save for the undeniable presence of death. Holmes moved with practiced ease, his sharp gaze sweeping over the chamber as he took in every detail. He strode to the large mahogany desk where a half-written letter lay abandoned, the ink dried in mid-sentence. He did not touch it, but instead studied the flow of the handwriting, murmuring to himself. The hand is steady, no tremors, no indication of sudden distress. He nodded to himself. He was not aware that death was upon him, not until it was far too late. He turned his attention to a small ornate clock upon the mantelpiece, shaped in the delicate form of a nightingale, its intricate metalwork gleaming faintly in the low light. The hands had stopped at 12:15 a.m. "Curious," he murmured. I peered at the object. "Perhaps it simply wound down." Holmes shook his head. "No, Watson. This is a precision timepiece, carefully maintained. It has not stopped by chance. It was stopped deliberately." He turned suddenly to our guide, a solemn-faced official who had watched our inspection in silence. "Tell me, who discovered the body?" The man hesitated. His Majesty's valet, sir. He entered at dawn to wake the king and found him. He trailed off. Holmes gave a curt nod. And yet the clock. Why stop it at 12:15? Unless, of course, our murderer wished to mark the precise moment of the crime. He cast one last glance around the room, his sharp eyes flickering with something I had learned to recognize, a spark of certainty. Yes, he murmured, this will do nicely. Holmes examined the physician standing before us, his fingers lightly pressed together as he listened to the man's account with unwavering attention. Dr. Reinhardt, the royal physician now turned prisoner, was a man of slight build, with sharp, intelligent eyes that burned with indignation. His cuffs bore the faint residue of ink, and his hands trembled, not with guilt, but with frustration. I have attended His Majesty for nearly a decade, he declared. If I wished him harm, I had 100 opportunities to do so before now. This charge against me is absurd, Mr. Holmes. They have sought a villain, and finding none, they have made me one. Holmes inclined his head. The poison, what do you know of it? The doctor exhaled sharply. Very little. No foreign substance was detected in his meals, nor in his wine. There was no bitterness on his lips, no scent upon his breath. But you observed something, Holmes prompted. A detail overlooked by others. Dr. Reinhardt hesitated. His Majesty's fingertips, Mr. Holmes. They bore a faint discoloration, only the barest tinge of blue. It was subtle, nearly invisible to the eye. Holmes's fingers drummed against his knee. Curious indeed, he murmured. And yet, you say the method of poisoning remains unknown. It does, Reinhardt admitted. The king was robust that evening, yet dead by dawn. I can only surmise that the toxin was slow-acting, administered in such a way as to leave no immediate trace. Holmes turned to me suddenly. What do you make of it, Watson? I considered. A substance absorbed through the skin, perhaps. A contact poison. Holmes's eyes gleamed. A most intriguing hypothesis, my dear fellow. Then, turning to Reinhardt, he asked, Tell me, Doctor, was the king in possession of any object he handled regularly before his death? A long silence followed. Then, with a furrowed brow, Reinhardt spoke 3 words that would alter the course of our investigation. His pocket watch. Holmes exchanged a glance with me, his expression unreadable. The nightingale knows, he murmured. The Bohemian palace was not merely a residence, it was a theatre of whispered intrigues. Within its halls, ambition and betrayal walked hand in hand, and every shadow seemed to hold a secret. Holmes and I moved discreetly through its corridors, observing those who had the most to gain, or lose, by the king's untimely demise. First, there was Prince Leopold. The king's younger brother was a man of commanding presence, with a military bearing that spoke of discipline and authority. The crown now fell to him, yet his face betrayed no joy, only a cold, unreadable resolve. He does not mourn, I whispered to Holmes. He does not need to, Holmes replied. He has been prepared for this moment for quite some time. But was Leopold a grieving brother, or a calculating usurper? Next we observed Countess Alara. Once the king's favoured mistress, she had been exiled under mysterious circumstances, only to return shortly before his death. She was beautiful, yes, but there was something in the way she carried herself, wary, watchful, as if she knew far more than she let on. She does not walk as one returning home, Holmes noted. She walks as one seeking something lost. Or concealing something found, I added. Finally, there was Prime Minister von Hartwig, a man of unshakable composure whose insistence on swiftly resolving the case suggested motives beyond justice. He was the one who had ordered the immediate arrest of Dr. Reinhardt, yet he had not once mentioned the missing timepiece. "What do you make of him, Holmes?" "He is either a fool," Holmes said quietly, "or a man who believes he is playing a game whose outcome is already determined." A silence passed between us. Then, in the distance, the great clock of the palace struck midnight. Holmes smiled faintly. "Come, Watson," he murmured. "The shadows are deep, but I dare say we shall soon see what lurks within them." Holmes stood at the palace window, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed upon the distant spires of Bohemia's capital. Though he had said little since we departed the chamber of the late king, I could see from the tautness of his frame and the quick, restless movement of his fingers that his mind was working at a furious pace. "Watson," he said at last, "tell me, what strikes you as most peculiar in this affair?" I hesitated. The absence of any clear means of poisoning, perhaps. The fact that the king's body bore no outward sign of distress. Holmes nodded. "A point of interest, certainly. And yet, it is not the method which concerns me most. It is the message." I recalled the cryptic words the king had uttered before his death. The Black Throne, betrayal in the shadow of the crown, the nightingale knows. "The Black Throne may refer to the king's seat," I said slowly. "But what of the rest?" Holmes turned from the window, his eyes flashing with keen intensity. "The true purpose of a cipher, Watson, is not merely to conceal meaning, but to reveal it to the right mind. We must assume that the king chose his words deliberately. Therefore, we must ask, who was meant to understand them? The Queen? Prince Leopold? Perhaps, Holmes murmured, or perhaps someone else entirely." He began pacing. "Consider, my dear fellow, what is the surest way to control an investigation?" "To lead it in the wrong direction," I answered. "Precisely." He stopped abruptly. "And what if our murderer has done just that? What if the meaning of the king's words has been twisted from the very start?" I felt a cold sensation creeping over me. "You suspect a deliberate deception?" Holmes' lips curved in a faint smile. "I suspect that we have been following a thread which someone else has carefully laid before us. The true game, my dear Watson, has only just begun." Holmes had been uncharacteristically silent throughout the evening, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze fixed upon the darkened streets beyond our chamber's window. It was only when a discreet knock sounded at the door that his expression flickered with interest. A uniformed courier entered, his manner brisk and efficient. "For Mr. Holmes," he announced, placing a small folded note upon the table before departing as swiftly as he had arrived. Holmes reached for the missive and opened it with a single flick of his wrist. His keen eyes scanned the contents, and a barely perceptible smile played upon his lips. Without a word, he passed it to me. The message was scrawled in a hurried, uneven hand. "Seek the nightingale at the Black Throne." A chill passed through me as I met Holmes's expectant gaze. "The king's words," I murmured. "Someone wants us to follow his last message." "Precisely, Watson. The question is, who and why now?" I hesitated. Could it be a warning, or perhaps a lure? Holmes leaned back, his expression unreadable. "It is both, my dear fellow. A warning that we are drawing too near to something hidden, and an invitation to step further into the dark." He tapped the note against the table. "The Black Throne," he mused. "It is either metaphorical, or it is something tangible, something within these palace walls." A sudden thought struck me. "Holmes! The royal throne itself! Could it be—" He rose abruptly, his eyes gleaming with sudden animation. "Come, Watson. If the answer lies in the Black Throne, then we have wasted quite enough time standing outside its shadow. Holmes strode through the palace corridors with purposeful energy, his coat billowing slightly as he moved. I followed in his wake, feeling the weight of unseen eyes upon us, for the very walls of that place seemed to whisper with conspiracies. The throne room, vast and silent, was cast in shadow. There, at the far end, beneath the heavy banners of Bohemia's royal lineage, sat the Black Throne, a seat of power that had withstood generations of intrigue and ambition. Holmes approached it with measured steps, his keen eyes sweeping over its intricate carvings. It was a formidable relic of dark oak, its arms etched with elaborate patterns, its high back adorned with symbols of kingship and dominion. I watched as Holmes ran his fingers lightly over the carved surface, pausing at a particular section near the base. His expression sharpened. "Watson," he said softly, "would you be so kind as to lend me your penknife?" I produced the instrument at once, and with deft precision, he pressed it into an almost imperceptible seam in the wood. A faint click sounded, followed by the slow, reluctant shift of a hidden panel. Inside the hollowed compartment lay a small bundle of letters, their edges singed and curling from the kiss of fire. "Burned," I murmured, crouching beside him. "Someone attempted to destroy them." Holmes retrieved a single fragment, holding it up to the dim light. His sharp gaze scanned the remnants of ink still legible upon the page. A single letter remained untouched by the flames. E. He exhaled slowly. "Countess Alara," he mused. "Or someone who wished us to think of her." Before I could respond, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the chamber. Holmes straightened. "It appears," he murmured, slipping the letter into his coat, "that we are no longer alone." Holmes held the scorched fragment between his fingers, his keen eyes flickering over the remnants of ink that had survived the flames. I leaned closer, my breath catching as I made out the only letter still visible. E. "Alara," I murmured. "Perhaps," Holmes replied, slipping the fragment into his pocket. "Or perhaps someone wished us to believe it was Alara." A sound at the chamber's entrance made me turn. In the dim light, a tall figure stood framed against the doorway, the Countess herself. Dressed in deep mourning, her face bore an expression of both defiance and unease. "You are trespassing, gentlemen," she said in a voice as smooth as silk. "His Majesty's throne room is no place for English detectives." Holmes straightened, his gaze piercing. "A throne room, madam, is the perfect place to uncover hidden truths, especially when someone has taken great pains to conceal them." Her lips curled into a faint, unreadable smile. "Then tell me, Mr. Holmes, what truth do you seek?" Holmes stepped forward. "A name, Countess. One that was meant to be destroyed, yet lingers still. Tell me, what did the king know of you that warranted such secrecy?" A shadow passed over her face. "The king was a cautious man," she said at length. "He knew more than he ever revealed." Holmes's fingers drummed against the arm of the throne. "And yet, he trusted you enough to let you return to Bohemia after your exile." A flicker of emotion, too fleeting to name, crossed her features. "A trust that may have cost him his life?" she asked softly. Holmes met her gaze. "That is precisely what I intend to determine." We had scarcely left the throne room when Holmes came to an abrupt halt in the corridor. He turned to me, his face alight with sudden realization. "Watson, we have been misled." I stared at him. "You mean the Countess?" "I mean the letter," he said sharply. "A single letter, Watson, cannot condemn a person. The simplest forgery could lead us astray." He began pacing. No, The answer lies elsewhere, with the nightingale. I frowned. The king's words. Not merely his words, Watson. His possession. Holmes's gaze was alight with excitement. The pocket watch, the one missing from his body. A thrill ran through me. Then someone removed it before the official investigation began. Exactly, Holmes said. A deliberate act, Watson. The king's watch was known to all, a cherished keepsake. If it vanished upon his death, it is because it held something vital. Then the question is, who had access to it? Holmes nodded. The body was discovered at dawn. The first to enter the chamber was the valet. But before him, he trailed off, his expression hardening. A single name passed his lips. The Queen. Holmes and I had scarcely turned a corner when a shadow detached itself from the gloom ahead. There was a sharp glint of steel, and in an instant, a figure lunged forward, a dagger flashing toward Holmes's chest. It was only Holmes's remarkable reflexes that saved him. With a swift sidestep, he evaded the thrust, the blade passing mere inches from where he had stood. I saw the assailant clearly now, a man dressed in the royal livery of Bohemia, his face masked by a dark scarf, his movements swift and calculated. Holmes twisted, seizing the attacker's wrist in a grip of iron, but the man was strong and well-trained. He broke free, striking out with his other hand. Holmes staggered back, and before I could think, the assailant turned his attention to me. There was a blur of motion, and I felt a sharp force collide with my shoulder. I was hurled against the stone wall, my vision swimming. A cold pressure settled in my chest as the assassin raised his dagger once more. I reached for my revolver with trembling fingers, but before I could fire, Holmes intervened. With a decisive motion, he drove his elbow into the attacker's ribs, forcing him back. The assassin hesitated for a mere second, but it was enough. I fired. The shot rang out, reverberating through the corridor. The man stumbled, clutching his side. For a moment, I thought we had him. But with a surprising burst of agility, he turned and fled, disappearing into the darkened passages of the palace. Holmes made to follow, but he stopped short, his gaze dropping to the trail of blood the man had left behind. "Well, Watson," he said, dusting off his coat, "it seems we have touched a nerve." I straightened, still breathless. "That man, he meant to kill you, Holmes." "Indeed," he mused, eyes gleaming with something almost akin to satisfaction. "And I do believe we are now dangerously close to the heart of the matter." Holmes stood over the droplets of scarlet upon the floor, his expression one of quiet triumph. He had been attacked, nearly killed, and yet he seemed wholly unperturbed. "This confirms it, Watson," he said, clasping his hands behind his back. I was still trying to steady my breathing. "Confirms what, Holmes? That someone wishes us dead?" "Precisely," he said. "And why, my dear fellow, would a man resort to such desperate measures unless he feared that we were close to unmasking him?" I exhaled sharply. "Then we must act at once. If we delay, our enemy may strike again." Holmes smiled faintly. "Ah, Watson, but now our enemy believes himself hidden, and that is his greatest mistake." He turned on his heel, already striding down the corridor. "Come, my friend. The noose is tightening, and I intend to be the one who pulls it." The morning after the assassination attempt, Holmes made his move. Word spread swiftly through the palace that the famed English detective had deciphered the dying king's words and would soon make a public declaration. The court, restless and divided in its loyalties, gathered in the great hall with murmurs of intrigue and unease. The air was thick with tension, as though the very stones of the palace held their breath. Holmes stood before them, composed and unflinching. His sharp gaze swept over the assembled nobles, his voice measured as he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is no secret that His Majesty's final words were cryptic in nature, yet to the trained mind they tell a tale as clear as ink upon a page." A hush fell. Eyes darted toward Prince Leopold, toward the Queen, toward Countess Alara. Who among them would be exposed? Holmes continued. "The Black Throne, a reference not merely to the royal seat, but to what lay hidden within it." He paused. "I have seen what was meant to be destroyed." A murmur rippled through the court. Holmes let it settle before proceeding. Betrayal in the shadow of the crown. The king did not speak of a single act of treachery, but of a conspiracy, one that had been forming for quite some time. The silence was deafening. And lastly, the nightingale knows. A message not about a bird, but about a watch. A timepiece that vanished the moment His Majesty fell. Holmes's eyes flashed. A watch that contained his final testament, hidden from those who wished him silenced forever. He let the weight of his words settle, then spoke with quiet authority. "I have arranged a midnight gathering in the throne room. Let all who seek the truth be there." The trap had been set. It was just before the appointed hour when Holmes and I arrived at the throne room. The great hall was dimly lit by flickering torches, the shadows stretching long across the marble floor. I took my position behind one of the towering pillars, my revolver in hand, while Holmes stood alone in the open, awaiting his quarry. The doors creaked open, and one by one, the figures entered. Prince Leopold, his expression unreadable. Countess Alara, draped in mourning. Prime Minister von Hartwig, his usual composure betraying the faintest trace of unease. And lastly, the Queen. She moved with the grace of one accustomed to command, yet there was something in her bearing that I had not seen before. A tension, a calculation. Holmes inclined his head. "Your Majesty, I trust you find this gathering illuminating." The Queen regarded him coldly. "If you have an accusation to make, Mr. Holmes, I suggest you do so." Holmes smiled faintly. "Ah, but it is not I who shall make it." He reached into his coat and produced the nightingale watch. There was a sharp intake of breath. The Queen's gloved hands clenched at her sides. The game was nearly over. Holmes pressed the small latch on the watch's casing. With a soft click, a hidden compartment was revealed, containing a tiny, delicate slip of parchment. "The king," Holmes said softly, "left us his final words, not in voice, but in ink." I saw it then, the flicker of something in the Queen's eyes. Not shock, not outrage, fear. Holmes had found his murderer. A silence hung over the great hall, the tension palpable as Holmes held the tiny slip of parchment aloft. The Queen's gaze remained fixed upon it, her gloved hands resting lightly against the folds of her gown. Yet I, who had observed many a guilty man beneath Holmes's scrutiny, saw the faintest tremor in her fingers. Holmes unfolded the note and read aloud. "If I am found dead, know this. Treachery sits beside me at my own table. The nightingale watches, the black throne hides the truth, but the crown shall fall by the hand of my own Queen." A collective gasp echoed through the chamber. All eyes turned toward Queen Margaret, whose pallor had deepened, though her composure remained intact. Prince Leopold took a single step forward, his features dark with shock. "Madam," he said, his voice measured but edged with disbelief, "you would not deny the words of my brother, written by his own hand." The Queen exhaled slowly, her sharp gaze shifting from the watch to Holmes himself. "And if I were to deny it, Mr. Holmes? If I were to call it a forgery, a desperate fabrication by those who seek to remove me from power?" Holmes gave a faint smile, one that did not reach his eyes. "You are welcome to make such a claim, Your Majesty, but it would be in vain. His Majesty, it seems, was a man who suspected treachery well before it came to his door." He turned the watch in his fingers, revealing the delicate engraving upon its inner lid. "The king was a man of foresight. This parchment is not merely written. It is burned into the casing of the watch itself, a message that could not be altered, could not be destroyed, and could not be disputed." Von Hartwig, who had remained silent until now, took a sharp step forward. "This is madness," he snapped. "A trick of shadows. You have no proof beyond a dying man's paranoia." Holmes turned on him with sudden intensity. "No proof? And what, sir, of the king's poisoning?" His voice rang out through the chamber. "For what reason was Dr. Reinhardt imprisoned on the very night of the king's murder? Who ordered his arrest, knowing full well that it would close the case before it could even begin?" Von Hartwig's mouth opened, but no words came forth. Holmes did not wait for a response. "And the method of poisoning," he continued. "The king handled only one object every night before he retired to bed. A timepiece, gifted to him by his late father, which he wound by hand without fail. An object that, when retrieved from his chamber, was missing." He turned once more to the Queen. "Tell me, Your Majesty, where was the watch before we uncovered it in Countess Ilara's possession?" A flicker of something passed over the Queen's face. She knew she had been caught. Yet when she spoke, it was not with fear, nor with desperation, but with chilling, quiet defiance. "You are a clever man, Mr. Holmes," she said smoothly. "And yet I wonder, does your cleverness extend to knowing what will become of Bohemia without me?" A slow smile curved upon Holmes's lips. "I believe we are about to find out, Your Majesty." And with that, the guards stepped forward, and the game was over. Holmes held the Nightingale watch aloft, its polished surface glinting in the dim torchlight of the throne room. The Queen's lips had pressed into a thin line, and I noted that her usually steady hands were now clenched tightly at her sides. She knew what was coming. Holmes turned to the assembled court. "This watch was believed to be lost, yet it was never truly absent from the palace," he announced. "It did not vanish. It was hidden." His gaze shifted to Countess Ilara, who met it with an expression I could not fully decipher. There was no fear in her, no guilt, only a deep, solemn weariness. "I trust, madam," Holmes said, "that you have something to tell us." She inclined her head. "I retrieved the watch from His Majesty's desk on the night of his death. I had no part in his murder, Mr. Holmes, but I knew that the moment he was found dead, the truth would be buried along with him." Holmes nodded approvingly. "You understood that the king had left behind something of great importance, and you knew that if it remained in the palace, it would fall into the hands of those who wished it destroyed." Von Hartwig's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "This is nonsense. A piece of metal proves nothing." Holmes smiled faintly. "And yet, Prime Minister, you have not asked why the watch was hidden. That is rather telling." The Queen shot von Hartwig a warning glance, but Holmes had already turned the timepiece in his fingers, his sharp eyes studying the delicate engravings upon its casing. "A puzzle within a puzzle," he murmured. Then, with a precise motion, he pressed a small, nearly invisible notch beneath the watch's lid. A soft click echoed through the chamber. A hidden compartment had revealed itself. The final proof had come to light. The tiny slip of parchment inside the watch's secret compartment was delicate with age, but the ink upon it remained sharp and clear. Holmes unfolded it carefully and began to read. "If I am found dead, know this. Treachery sits beside me at my own table. The nightingale watches. The black throne hides the truth, but the crown shall fall by the hand of my own queen." The room fell into a stunned silence. Then, slowly, every eye turned toward Queen Margaret. She did not flinch. Instead, she let out a slow breath, as if shedding a burden she had carried for too long. "My husband was always a man of foresight," she murmured. "Even in death, he remains an obstacle." Prince Leopold's voice was grave. "You do not deny it, madam." A slow, humorless smile curled at her lips. "Deny it?" she repeated. "No, Your Highness. What would be the point?" Holmes closed the watch with a final snap. "Then, madam," he said coolly, "I believe this conversation has reached its conclusion." And so, the Queen of Bohemia was led away to face her fate. For a long moment, no one in the great hall spoke. The Queen's confession had settled upon the assembled court like a funeral shroud, and even those who had once whispered of her ambitions could scarcely believe the depths of her treachery. Holmes, ever the master of timing, allowed the weight of the revelation to hang in the air before he turned to the royal guards. "Gentlemen, I believe you know your duty." A dozen men stepped forward, their hands moving instinctively to the hilts of their swords. Queen Margaret straightened, her composure unshaken, though I thought I detected the faintest trace of bitterness in her smile. "There is a strange irony in this," she murmured. "A woman does what she must in a world ruled by men, and for that she is called a villain." Holmes's gaze was impassive. "Villainy, madam, is not measured by ambition but by action, and your actions, I fear, have sealed your fate." Prime Minister von Hartwig, who had remained silent in the wake of the Queen's admission, now took a sharp step forward, his face pale with rage. "This is an outrage!" he bellowed. "You would take the word of a dead man over that of a loyal statesman! This is nothing but English trickery!" Holmes regarded him coolly. "And the attempt upon my life, sir? Was that English trickery as well?" Von Hartwig blanched. Holmes continued, his voice quiet but unyielding. "You ordered the arrest of Dr. Reinhardt before the ink on the king's death certificate had dried. You sought to control the narrative, to close the case before any true investigation could begin. And when I proved a greater inconvenience than you anticipated, you sent an assassin to ensure my silence." Von Hartwig's mouth opened, then closed. The truth was upon him, undeniable and inescapable. At a nod from Prince Leopold, the guards stepped forward once more. The Queen did not resist, nor did she offer further words in her defence. She had ruled as a queen. Now, she would fall as a traitor. And with that, the conspirators were led away, leaving only the echoes of their downfall behind them. Prince Leopold stood apart from the gathering, his features ashen, his gaze fixed upon the empty space where his brother had once sat upon the black throne. The weight of succession, once an abstraction, now loomed before him as a terrible certainty. Holmes studied him for a moment before speaking. "It is not an easy thing, Your Highness, to inherit a kingdom stained with treachery." Leopold exhaled heavily. "My brother was a just man," he said at last. "Perhaps too just. He believed that honour could shield him from those who envied his power. He was wrong." Holmes nodded. "Power, Your Highness, is never envied. It is coveted. And when it is not taken by force, It is stolen through subtler means. Leopold's hands curled into fists. Margaret was my brother's wife, von Hartwig, his most trusted adviser. How could they have conspired against him? He shook his head. I have spent my life preparing for war upon the battlefield, and yet the greatest danger to this kingdom came not from an enemy abroad, but from within these very walls. Holmes's gaze was measured. You may find, Your Highness, that the greatest battles are fought not with steel, but with cunning. Leopold turned to him. And what would you have me do, Mr. Holmes? Holmes considered for a moment. Rule wisely. Learn from your brother's misjudgments, but do not forsake his virtues. His mistake was not in his belief in honour, but in trusting those who had none. Leopold nodded slowly. Then I must trust no one. Holmes smiled faintly. Not no one, Your Highness, but choose carefully, for even the sharpest blade is useless if placed in the wrong hands. A silence passed between them. Then, straightening his shoulders, the new king of Bohemia turned toward his throne. The crown was his, but the shadow of betrayal would linger for a long time to come. A hush fell upon the court as Holmes stepped forward, his gaze sweeping across the gathered assembly. Prince Leopold sat rigid upon the throne, his knuckles white against the gilded armrests. The Queen had been led away, and von Hartwig stood in stunned silence, his face betraying the first flickers of true fear. Holmes cleared his throat. The late king was not a man prone to carelessness, nor did he place his trust in sentiment alone. His final words were no desperate ramblings, but rather a carefully crafted message, a puzzle intended for the right mind to decipher. He lifted the nightingale watch between two fingers. Let us begin with the last of his clues. The nightingale knows. His Majesty's pocket watch, a treasured possession, was missing when his body was found. An innocent theft, perhaps? Unlikely. The king wound this watch every night before retiring. He would have held it in his hands moments before his death. The Prime Minister flinched. Holmes did not miss it. This led me to a simple conclusion. The method of poisoning was not through food nor drink, but through contact. The king did not consume his poison. He touched it. Gasps rippled through the court. Holmes continued. And yet, even this was not his murderer's greatest mistake. The greater error lay in underestimating the foresight of the victim. The king suspected treachery before it came for him. He left us a final warning, but his assassins ensured that no one would hear it. He turned to Prince Leopold. Which brings us to the phrase, betrayal in the shadow of the crown. This was no vague poeticism, Your Highness. The king knew that someone within his own court plotted against him. And whom did he name? He opened the hidden compartment within the watch and extracted the tiny slip of parchment. The air in the room seemed to thicken as Holmes read aloud. If I am found dead, know this. Treachery sits beside me at my own table. The final words of a doomed king. And then, at last, Holmes turned to the throne itself. The Black Throne. It was here that the king hid the proof of his suspicions, the letters meant to unmask his killers. He reached into his coat and withdrew the charred fragments he had found concealed within its base. The evidence was burned, yes, but not before the king's final letter was inscribed upon this watch, beyond the reach of flame. Silence. No one spoke. No one moved. And then, with the slow certainty of a man condemned, von Hartwig dropped to his knees. The parchment within the nightingale watch was fragile, but its words remained clear, untouched by time or fire. Holmes held it delicately between his fingers, his voice measured as he read. I fear that I shall not live to see the truth come to light. Those who once swore loyalty have conspired against me, and their whispers grow louder with each passing night. If my life is taken, look first to the one who wears my crown, and then to the hand that guides it. Holmes looked up. It is evident, then, that the king had already foreseen his demise. He suspected both his queen and his prime minister, yet his trust in those around him faltered only when it was too late. Leopold, pale but composed, studied the parchment in Holmes's hand. And still he did nothing? Holmes's expression was unreadable. Perhaps he hoped he was wrong. Perhaps he believed that even in treachery there was still love. He exhaled softly. Or perhaps he knew that his enemies would only reveal themselves in the moment of their victory. Von Hartwig, his composure shattered, was led away by the guards, his fate sealed alongside that of his queen. The court was left shaken, their world irrevocably altered by the truth. Holmes turned to me, his voice quiet. A man who fears betrayal may build walls of steel, Watson, but the sharpest blade is often hidden within the folds of silk. I shuddered at the thought. Even a king had not been safe. We departed the palace at dawn. The sky streaked with the first light of day. The air was crisp, yet it carried the weight of all that had transpired within those great halls. I walked beside Holmes in silence for some time before I spoke. "It is remarkable," I said at last, "how the answer lay before us from the very beginning. And yet, had it not been for your deductions, I doubt anyone would have seen it for what it was." Holmes made a dismissive gesture. "The facts, Watson, were always present. It is simply that men see only what they wish to see." I shook my head. "Even so, you unravelled a scheme that would have otherwise gone unpunished. It is no small feat to outwit those who would kill a king." Holmes exhaled lightly, drawing his coat tighter against the morning chill. "Power, my dear fellow, is a game as old as time. Kings, queens, ministers, they come and go, and the world moves forward regardless. The real question is not who sits upon the throne, but who moves the pieces around it." I glanced at him. "And are you not satisfied that you have removed the most dangerous of those pieces?" A rare smile played at his lips. He reached into his coat, producing his pipe, and struck a match. "Elementary, my dear Watson," he murmured. And with that, we stepped into the streets of Bohemia, leaving the shadow of the Black Throne behind us. The case is closed. Or is it? As we strolled through the mist-laden streets of Bohemia, the weight of the case still lingered upon my mind. Holmes walked beside me in his usual unhurried manner, his hands deep in his coat pockets, his thoughts seemingly elsewhere. "You have been uncommonly quiet, Watson," he observed at last. "A rare occurrence indeed." I sighed. "It is simply that the case was unsettling. The king suspected his own downfall, yet failed to prevent it. Even with all his foresight, he could not escape the noose that had been drawn around him." Holmes exhaled a thin stream of smoke from his pipe. "A man may foresee the storm, Watson, but if he chooses to stand in its path, he cannot claim surprise when he is swept away." I frowned. "You mean to say the king allowed his own fate to unfold?" Holmes gave a slight shrug. Perhaps not deliberately, but his greatest weakness was believing that those closest to him could be anything other than what they truly were. A ruler must suspect all, or he is ruled by those who do. I nodded slowly, mulling over his words. The king had left behind a warning, a puzzle, but in the end, he had still fallen to those he trusted most. Holmes stopped at the edge of the square, adjusting his coat against the morning chill. "Tell me, Watson, what do you believe was the Queen's greatest mistake?" I hesitated. "Poisoning the king." He smiled faintly. Her greatest mistake was underestimating the mind that would unravel her scheme. And with that, he stepped forward, disappearing into the London-bound train. Now, dear viewer, what do you think was the most fatal mistake in this case? Was it the Queen's overconfidence, the Prime Minister's haste, or the King's failure to act in time? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this mystery, be sure to subscribe for more thrilling Sherlock Holmes adventures. Don't forget to share this story with fellow detective fiction lovers. Until the next case, the game is afoot.